Adaeze stood in her mother's driveway, a single silver key cold in her palm. A brand new charcoal grey Honda sat where her father's old truck used to be. For one dizzying second, she thought the key was hers. Then she heard the twins scream. She heard the twins screaming behind her, press a second key into Chidi's hand, a third into Chioma's, and the truth hit like a slap. This celebration had nothing to do with her. It was their 30th birthday. She was 34. When she finally found her voice and asked if there was anything for her too, her father looked at her the way you look at a bill you forgot. He sighed and said 6 words that broke something in her chest that had held steady for over a decade. Ada, you're old. Understand. Before you find out what those words were hiding, hit subscribe, tap like, and type in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Because what Ada discovers 3 weeks later will make you rewatch this entire moment differently. Nobody in the Okafor family had ever called Ada spoiled. That was the joke that wasn't a joke. The thing aunties whispered at parties with syrupy affection dripped over quiet judgment. Ada was the responsible one. Ada was the one who dropped out of her second year of nursing school when her father's import business collapsed in 2011. Who took double shifts at a diner in Houston so her parents wouldn't lose the house, who mailed money home to Enugu every single month for 6 years to keep her grandmother's medical bills paid, all while her twin siblings, 6 years younger, finished university without a single missed semester, without a single sacrificed birthday, without a single night spent crying into a diner apron because the tips didn't cover rent. Ada told herself, for 14 years, that sacrifice made without resentment was the purest kind of love. She believed it so completely that she never noticed the debt was one-directional. She never noticed that love, when it only flows one way for long enough, starts to look a lot like erosion. She was 34 now, a single mother to an 8-year-old boy named Kelechi, working as a licensed vocational nurse on the overnight shift at a hospital outside Houston, renting a 2-bedroom apartment where the air conditioner rattled like it was trying to escape the wall. She had not asked her parents for money in 9 years. She sent them money, still, more months than not. So when her mother called and said, breathless with excitement, "Come home this weekend, we have a surprise for the twins," Ada assumed, reasonably, she thought, that whatever it was, she would be standing beside her siblings when it happened. The way she always had been. The eldest daughter who built the floor everyone else got to stand on. She was wrong. And the moment she understood how wrong, standing in that driveway with the wind pulling at her jacket and her father's words hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear, something in her went very quiet. Not loud. Not dramatic. Quiet in the way a house goes quiet right before a storm hits it. "What do you mean I understand?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "Understand what, Papa?" Her father, Emeka Okafor, a broad man who had once carried sacks of imported rice on his shoulders like they weighed nothing, would not meet her eyes. "You have Kelechi. You have your own life already built. Your brother and sister are just starting. They need the foundation." He said it like a man reciting a rule he hadn't written, a rule he didn't fully believe but had decided to enforce anyway. Behind him, Ada's mother, Ngozi, was hugging Chioma so tightly that her wrapper had come loose at the shoulder, laughing, crying, saying something in Igbo too fast for Ada to catch except for the word blessing, repeated 3 times like a prayer. Chidi, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable. He caught Ada's eye across the driveway and something passed over his face. Not guilt exactly, something closer to the flinch of a man watching an accident he can't stop. He mouthed something. Ada thought it might have been later. She would think about that flinch for weeks afterward, turning it over like a coin she couldn't decide was real or counterfeit. Ada did not cry in the driveway. She had spent a lifetime training herself not to cry in front of people who needed her to be strong, and the habit did not break just because for once it was her turn to need something. She smiled, a thin, correct smile, congratulated her siblings, admired the cars, hugged her mother, and drove the 90 minutes back to Houston with both hands locked on the steering wheel and her jaw so tight it ached by the time she reached her apartment complex. Kelechi was asleep in the back seat. She carried him inside, laid him in his bed, and then sat down on her kitchen floor. Not the couch, the floor, because some pain wants you low to the ground, and let herself finally break silently into a dish towel, so her son wouldn't wake and see his mother falling apart over a house she was never going to get. What Ada did not know that night, what none of the Okafor children knew, was that 17 days earlier, an envelope had arrived at her parents' house from a law office in Enugu, and that envelope was the real reason 2 new cars now sat gleaming in that driveway, though not for the reason anyone would have guessed, and not with the intention anyone in that driveway believed they understood. Her father's strange, clipped words that day, "You're old, you understand," were not cruelty. They were the sound of a man trying to keep a promise he'd made to a dying woman 15 years earlier, a promise he did not yet know how to keep without breaking his eldest daughter's heart first. Emeka Okafor had never been good at explaining himself. He had only ever been good at obeying. And what he had been asked to obey was about to upend everything Ada thought she understood about her place in this family. For 3 weeks, Ada tried to bury it. She went to work, she packed Kelechi's lunches, cartoon-shaped sandwiches cut into stars because it made him smile, and she smiled back at him like her whole chest wasn't hollowed out. She stopped answering her mother's calls on the first ring. She let them go to voicemail, then called back hours later with a flatness in her voice she used to reserve for difficult patients' families. Her mother noticed. Mothers always notice, even the ones who cause the wound. "You're avoiding us," Ngozi said on the 4th unreturned call Ada finally picked up. "I'm working, Mama." "Ada." A pause, heavy with things unsaid. "Your father wants to talk to you. Properly. Not like that day." "There's nothing to talk about. You made your decision. I understand." She used her father's word back at him, deliberately, like a blade returned to its owner. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would not make sense to Ada until much later, something that snagged in her mind like a splinter she couldn't dig out. "You don't understand, and that is the problem. Your father should have told you years ago." I told him this would happen." And then, before Ada could ask what would happen, what she should have been told, her mother made an excuse about the stove and hung up. Ada sat with the phone against her ear long after the call ended, that sentence looping in her mind. I told him this would happen. Told him what would happen. Her mother didn't hang up on people. Her mother filled silences, over-explained, apologized 3 times for things that needed no apology. A woman like that did not vanish mid-conversation unless something larger than embarrassment was pushing her toward the door. Ada's nursing instincts, the ones trained to catch the small sign before the large collapse, began to itch. Something was being hidden, and the not knowing was worse somehow than the driveway had been. If you've ever felt like the family sacrifice nobody remembered to repay, drop a comment below and let this story sit with you for a minute. Because Ada is about to find out that what she thought was rejection was actually the edge of a secret her family had been circling for 15 years. The following Saturday, Chidi showed up at Ada's apartment unannounced, standing in her doorway with his hands jammed in his pockets and an expression she hadn't seen on him since he was 19 and had wrecked their father's car without telling anyone. Guilt wore the same face at any age. "You didn't come for Sunday dinner," he said, which was not an apology but was, from Chidi, close enough to count as one. "I've been busy." "Ada," he exhaled, "can I come in?" She let him in mostly because Kelechi ran to hug his uncle's legs and it would have felt cruel to make the boy witness a closed door. They sat at her small kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and Chidi turned a glass of water in slow circles without drinking it, the way people do when they're rehearsing a sentence they're afraid to say. "There's something about the houses," he finally said. "Something Papa didn't tell you. Didn't tell either of us, actually, not the whole thing." Ada's pulse ticked up. "What thing?" "The money didn't come from Papa's business. You know his business barely survived the last 5 years. He couldn't have paid cash for 2 houses, even if he sold everything he owns twice over." Chidi looked up at her. "It came from Nigeria, from Grandma Adaeze's land." Ada went still. Her grandmother, her namesake, the woman who had died when Ada was 19, the woman whose cocoa farm outside Enugu had sat mostly forgotten for over a decade because nobody in the family had the money or the will to fight the paperwork required to claim it. That land was the punchline of a family joke about inheritances nobody would ever actually receive. The farm, Chidi, that land was basically worthless. Papa said the co-op collapsed years ago. It's not worthless anymore. Chidi's voice dropped like the words themselves were dangerous to say too loud. A construction company wants it. There's a new highway going in near Enugu, some kind of expansion, and Grandma's 12 acres happen to sit right where they need to build. Papa got an offer, a big one. Big enough for 2 houses and change. He hesitated. Uncle Obinna has been trying to get his hands on that land for years, Ada. You remember how he used to fight with Papa about it after Grandma died. He's the one who found out about the highway first. He's the one who's been pushing Papa to sell fast before, his words, people start asking who the land really belongs to. Ada's mind was already 3 steps ahead of her mouth, the itch from her mother's phone call, sharpening into something closer to alarm. Who does the land belong to? Chidi didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Ada felt something cold settle low in her stomach. The specific, familiar dread of a nurse watching vital signs shift just before a code is called. The sense that whatever came next would change the room permanently. That's what I came to tell you, Chidi finally said. But I think it should come from Papa, not me. Ada stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. No, you brought it this far, you finish it. I am done being handed half of things in this family, Chidi. Tell me. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, the flinch from the driveway, back again, told her that whatever he was about to say had been sitting on his chest for weeks, maybe longer. Grandma Adaeze didn't leave that land to Papa, he said quietly. She left it to you. In writing, 15 years ago before she died. You, not Papa, not any of his brothers. You by name. For a second, the kitchen seemed to tilt. That's not possible, Ada said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was remembering things, fragments she'd buried. A summer she was 17 spent in Enugu helping her grandmother in the cocoa fields, while her younger siblings stayed home in Texas, her grandmother's papery hand gripping hers under the mango tree, saying something in Igbo Ada had been too young and too tired to fully translate at the time. Something about the strength in her hands, something about the land remembering who worked it. Ada had thought it was an old woman's sentimentality. She had never imagined it was a will being spoken aloud. It's true, Chidi said. Papa's known the whole time. He's had the documents locked in a drawer since she died, because Uncle Obinna threatened to contest it, threatened to drag the whole family through a legal fight in Nigeria that could take years and cost money none of us had. Papa decided to just sit on it, wait, protect it quietly instead of fighting loudly. And then the highway offer came in, and suddenly sitting on it wasn't an option anymore, because if word got out that the land was worth something, Uncle Obinna was going to move fast to challenge the will before anyone could stop him. Ada's throat had gone tight. So he sold it without telling me. He sold my grandmother's land, my land, if what you're saying is true, and used the money to buy houses for you in Chioma. No, Chidi shook his head hard. That's what I need you to understand, Ada. And it's why I came here today instead of letting you keep hating him for something he didn't do. Papa didn't sell your inheritance to buy us houses. He used his own savings, a loan against his shop, everything he had, scraped together over months, to buy me and Chioma our houses, because he was terrified that if he waited, if he used any part of the land money before your name was legally cleared on the deed, Uncle Obinna's lawyers could argue the family had already treated the proceeds as shared property, and that would weaken your claim. He nearly bankrupted himself, buying us those cars and houses with money that had nothing to do with you, right? Specifically, so nobody could ever say your inheritance got divided before you even knew it existed. Chidi's voice cracked slightly. That day in the driveway when he said you're old, you understand, I think he meant something completely different than what you heard. I think he meant, you're grown enough to handle bigger, and I need time to make sure bigger is actually yours before I tell you. He's just never been a man who explains himself well. You know that about him. Ada sat back down slowly, her legs no longer trusting themselves to hold her upright. 14 years of feeling like the family's afterthought were rearranging themselves in her mind, piece by piece, into something entirely different, not less painful exactly, but painful in a new and disorienting shape. If this was true, she had not been forgotten. She had been protected, badly, silently, by a man who did not know how to protect someone without also accidentally wounding them in the process. But something else was surfacing too, something colder. "Why now?" she said. "Why is Uncle Obinna suddenly moving fast enough that Papa panicked into buying 2 houses in 1 week?" Chidi's jaw tightened, because 3 days ago Uncle Obinna filed papers in an Enugu court claiming Grandma's will was never properly witnessed. He's trying to get the land declared unclaimed, so it reverts to him as the eldest surviving son of the family. If he wins, Ada, it isn't just the land he takes, it's proof that Grandma chose you over her own children. And there are people in that family who have hated you for that since before you were born. He hesitated, then added the part that made Ada's blood run cold. Papa found out yesterday that Obinna has someone inside the land registry office backdating documents. If they succeed before Papa can get the real will authenticated and filed, there won't be anything left to fight for. You could lose everything Grandma left you permanently in about 10 days. If your chest just tightened reading that, take a breath and like this video. Because this story is about to head somewhere none of you are expecting. And if it's already hitting you emotionally, say so in the comments. Because Ada's fight for what's rightfully hers is only just beginning. Ada barely slept that week. She kept replaying her grandmother's voice under the mango tree, straining to remember the words she'd let slide past her as a distracted 17-year-old. She called her mother, finally ready to hear the truth instead of avoiding it. Ngozi wept on the phone, apologizing for the silence, explaining that she had begged Emeka for years to just tell Ada the truth and let the chips fall. But he was a proud man, raised by an even prouder father, and pride, in men like that, often disguised itself as protection until it curdled into something that looked exactly like neglect. "He loves you the loudest of all his children," her mother said through tears, "and he has always been the worst at showing it. I told him 15 years of silence would cost him something. I did not know it would almost cost him you." Ida flew to Enugu 6 days later, using money she didn't have, leaving Kelechi with a neighbour she trusted, because if her inheritance, her name, her grandmother's final wish, the truth of who she had always been to that old woman under the mango tree, was going to be stolen by a man who had spent decades resenting his mother's choice, Ada was not going to sit in Texas and let it happen without a fight. Her father met her at the airport, and for the first time in 14 years, Emeka Okafor cried in front of his daughter, gripping her hands in the middle of the arrivals hall and saying, over and over, "I am sorry, I did this wrong, I did this so wrong," while Ada, exhausted and furious and unbearably moved all at once, let him hold on. What followed was not a quiet family matter. It became, over the next 4 days, a battle fought in a cramped Enugu courtroom, where a lawyer Ada's father had hired years earlier and never fully paid produced the original will, witnessed, notarized, undisputed for 15 years until money made it suddenly worth disputing, and where Uncle Obinna sat rigid in a borrowed suit, his forged registry documents unravelling under a judge's patient, unimpressed questioning. The twist that Ada had not seen coming, the one that made her hands shake in the courtroom gallery, was the moment her grandmother's old house help, a quiet woman named Mama Ifeoma, who had cared for the family for 30 years, stood up as a surprise witness and testified that she had personally watched Grandma Adaeze write that will, had heard her say, clear as a church bell, that Ada was the only grandchild who had ever come to that farm not to inherit it, but to work it beside her, hands in the same soil, asking nothing in return. It was that memory, Mama Ifeoma said, that convinced the old woman the land belonged with the one grandchild who had never once asked for it. The court ruled in Ada's favour. Obinna's claim collapsed, along with, by the following week, most of his standing in a family that had quietly known for years what kind of man he was, and had simply never had proof loud enough to say it aloud. Ada stood on her grandmother's land 3 days later, the cocoa trees overgrown but still standing, the mango tree from her memory taller now, its shade wider, and she understood, finally, standing in a place both wildly unfamiliar and strangely like coming home, that the driveway moment, the cars, the houses, the 6 devastating words, had never been the whole story. It had only ever been the first page of one. If this story moved you even a little, comment your thoughts below and give it a like. Stories like this deserve to be seen by people who need to hear them tonight. She did not sell the land, not right away. The highway construction company's offer was still on the table, still substantial, still enough to change the trajectory of her and Kelechi's entire life. But Ada asked for time, and time, for once, was something she was finally allowed to take without apologizing for it. She spent 2 more weeks in Enugu, walking the 12 acres every morning with her father, who talked more in those 14 days than he had in the previous 14 years, filling in gaps she hadn't known were missing. Stories about his mother's stubbornness, about the year the cocoa crop failed and the whole family nearly went under, about how Grandma Adaeze used to say that land, real land, chose its keeper the way rivers choose their banks, slowly and without asking permission from anyone standing on the shore. On her last evening there, Ada sat with her father under the mango tree, the same one, and finally asked him the question that had been sitting under her ribs since Chidi's confession. Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning? Even with the risk, even with Obina, I would rather have known and worried than not known and grieved. Emeka was quiet for a long time, turning a mango leaf between his fingers. Because the day I buried my mother, he finally said, I made her a promise at her graveside that I would protect what she left you until the day it was safe to hand it to you whole. I thought protecting meant hiding. I did not understand until I watched your face in that driveway that hiding a gift from the person it belongs to does not feel like protection to them. It feels like erasure. He looked at her, his eyes wet in the fading light. I am an old man who was taught that love looks like sacrifice and silence. You taught yourself, without anyone showing you how, that love should also look like honesty. I am trying, very late, to learn from my daughter instead of only expecting her to learn from me. Ada did not fully forgive him that night. Some wounds need longer than a single conversation under a mango tree. But something between them shifted permanently, the way a door that has been stuck for years finally gives way, not because the hinge is fixed, but because someone, at last, pushed hard enough and long enough to move it. Before we get to how Ada's story ends, if you're the type of viewer who lives for stories with real twists and family secrets that finally come to light, hit that subscribe button now, because there's a lot more where this came from. Ada returned to Texas 4 months ago now, and the version of her life that exists today looks almost unrecognizable from the woman who sat crying into a dish towel on her kitchen floor. She ultimately did sell 8 of the 12 acres to the construction company, keeping the 4 acres closest to the mango tree, the ones with the oldest cocoa trees, the ones Mama Ifeoma still tends for her, because Ada could not bring herself to let go of all of it, not after everything it had taken to understand what it meant. With her share of the proceeds, she paid off her debts, moved herself and Kelechi into a modest but sturdy house of her own, not as large as her siblings, and she has told friends since with a small private smile that she likes it that way, likes that what she has now she chose herself rather than had handed to her. And she returned to nursing school part-time, finishing at 35, the degree she had abandoned at 19 to hold her family together. Chidi and Chioma, for their part, have never quite gotten over the guilt of those 2 shiny cars sitting in the driveway while their sister found out what real inheritance had cost her. Chioma cried the first time she saw the 4 remaining acres in person, standing under the mango tree. Finally understanding what their grandmother had seen in the sister, none of them had ever thought to ask enough questions about. The Okafor family gathers differently now, slower, more honestly, with fewer secrets folded quietly into drawers where they can calcify into decades of misunderstanding. Emeka still struggles to say the softer things out loud, but he calls Ada every Sunday now, without fail, and he always ends the call the same way, telling her, plainly, that he is proud of her, a sentence it took him 35 years to learn how to say. What Ada carries forward from all of it is not bitterness. She made a deliberate choice, somewhere in that Enugu courtroom, not to let this become a story that hardened her, but a hard-won clarity about the difference between being loved and being told you are loved. For years, she mistook her family's silence for indifference, when it had actually been fear wearing indifference's clothes. She learned that people who love badly are not always people who don't love enough. Sometimes they are people who never learned a better language for it, and the only way to find out which kind you're dealing with is to ask the question you're afraid of the answer to, instead of quietly building a life around the wound and calling it acceptance. Before you go, subscribe, share this story with someone who needed to hear it, and tell us in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you're taking from Ada's story tonight? Because somewhere out there, someone watching this is sitting in their own version of that driveway, wondering if they've been forgotten. And the truth, more often than any of us want to admit, is usually far more complicated and far more human than it first appears.